Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 58, Rolf Boldrewood. Thomas Alexander Browne, or as he was otherwise known, his nom de plume for writing, Rolf Boldrewood, has popped up in some of my past episodes. In Blue Cap the Bushranger in episode 29, and his friendship with the Broughton family in episode 42, Rose Lodge. I was intrigued to know more about this man. He was a pastoralist, he was a police magistrate, a gold commissioner, but he's also best known as the Australian novelist. Thomas Browne was born on the 6th of August 1826 in London. He was the eldest child of Sylvester John Browne, a shipmaster who had served with the East India Company, and his wife Elizabeth Angell Alexander. Thomas arrived in Australia at 5 years old when his father, captaining his own bark, the Proteus, delivered a cargo of convicts at Hobart Town and then went forward to land at Sydney in August 1831 with his wife and 3 children. The family lived firstly at Macquarie Place, but after Captain Browne had engaged profitably in whaling and trading, he built a stone mansion and called it Enmore, thus naming a Sydney suburb. Thomas Browne was educated at the private academy of William Timothy Cape in King Street from 1831, and then at Sydney College when Cape became its first headmaster. Thomas received a good classical training and led a happy, healthy life with his schoolmates. One of Browne's closest school friends was a son of Colonel John George Nathaniel Gibbs, MLC, the Collector of Customs for New South Wales, and according to the Dulhunty papers, Browne spent carefree holidays staying with the Gibbs family at their grand waterside residence at Sydney's Point Piper. Thomas remained a boarder at Sydney College when his enterprising father overlanded with stock to the new settlement at Port Phillip in 1838, taking up a run near Mount Macedon. His father bought city allotments and instituted the first steamer ferry service between Melbourne and Williamstown. In 1839, Sylvester Browne brought his family to Melbourne and built a country home they called Heartlands in Heidelberg on the banks of the Yarra River. Thomas arrived in Victoria 2 years later and completed his education in Melbourne under Reverend David Boyd. In 1843, although only 17 years old, Thomas took up a cattle run on the lower Umarella in the Portland district, which he called Squattlesea Mere. In 1846, after economic depression had caused his father's ruin and breakdown, he made a home there for 10 years for his mother and 6 unmarried sisters. Except for some early armed encounters with Aboriginals, he prospered and enjoyed the squatter's life with such gusto that his account of it in his delightful Old Melbourne Memories, published in Melbourne in 1884, reads more like picnicking than pioneering. However, in 1858 he sold the run and bought a sheep station at Murrabit on the Murray near Swan Hill in Victoria. In 1860 he visited England and Ireland, and then he returned, and on the 1st of August 1861 at St Thomas's Church at Mulgoa he married Margaret Maria Riley, the granddaughter of Alexander Riley of Raby, and they had 4 sons and 5 daughters. But like his father, prodigal expenditure, speculative adventures and bad seasons brought his downfall, and by 1863 his debts amounted to £40,000 and he was forced to sell his Murrabit run. From 1864 he ran Bundidgery Sheep Station near Narrandera, New South Wales, and this was leased by 2 brothers-in-law until severe droughts 1866 and 1868 compelled him in 1869 to give up squatting. In 1865, while recovering from a riding accident, he wrote 2 articles on pastoral life in the colonies for the Cornhill magazine, and he also began to contribute articles and serial stories to the Australian weeklies. It was not until 1870, when in Sydney, that he began writing industriously to support his family. After living near the Parramatta River, between Sydney and Parramatta for a short time, in April 1871 he became a civil servant and was appointed a police magistrate at Gulgong, and in 1872 Gold Commissioner. As magistrate, he was an experienced Justice of the Peace, having acted as chairman on the bench at Narrandera, but in his first years at Gulgong, then one of the richest and largest goldfields in New South Wales, his ignorance of mining and the complicated regulations drew criticism of his competence as a commissioner. He was persistently attacked by the Goulburn Guardian until in 1873 it published an anonymous letter accusing him of bias and corruption. The Goulburn Guardian's editor, Thomas Frederick de Courcy, took Browne to court, and Browne was convicted in Sydney of criminal libel and was sentenced to 6 months' jail. The charges against Thomas Browne were disproved, and he won favour with the miners by magnanimously interceding with the judge for a light punishment of his libeller. From descriptive articles he turned to fiction, and from 1873 to 1880 he had 7 novels published as serials in the Australian Town and Country Journal, with 4 others later in the Sydney Mail and Centennial magazine. His first book, printed in 1878, Ups and Downs, was a realistic description of his squatting experiences in fictional form and originally published as the serial The Squatter's Dream in 1875. For the serial, he first adopted his pen name, taking Boldrewood from Scots Marmion and prefacing it with the Norse Rolf. And there was a small article alluding to his pen name. Why did Thomas Alexander Browne elect to use the name of Rolf Boldrewood? He must have been influenced to it by something. There is a parish in a village of the name of Boldre in Hampshire, standing near the Lymington River and town, and on a stream named the Boldre Water, where it flows into the Solent. It has an interesting old church, and more than half of the parish lies in the New Forest. There is a Boldre Wood, and there is a Boldre Wood house, once the residence of a county family, but now used as a keeper's lodge or cottage. The name seems to join up with the Southampton, Portsmouth, and the Captain Sylvester John Browne, who was the father of Rolf Boldrewood. He quoted that his mother was his earliest admirer and most indulgent critic, to whom is chiefly due whatever praise my readers may hereafter vouchsafe. In 1881, Browne transferred as a magistrate and mining warden to Dubbo, New South Wales. Whilst at Dubbo in 1882, Browne wrote to a friend, "I'm also writing rather a sensational novel in the Sydney Mail called Robbery Under Arms." At this stage he was a man with 8 children and a limited income, and he must do all that he could to supplement that income. The story initially was rejected by 2 journals, before accepted by the Sydney Mail, and it was published as a weekly serial from the 1st of July 1882 to the 11th of August 1883. The tale's stirring adventures of cattle duffing and bushranging aroused keen interest, and when published in London in 1888, it achieved wide popularity in England, America, and other English-speaking countries. Some of the events in the book are based on actual incidents carried out by bushrangers, like Daniel Morgan, Ben Hall, Frank Gardner, James Elpin Macpherson, and John Gilbert, and 2 of which, Daniel Morgan and Frank Gardner, I have detailed episodes on. Robbery Under Arms has remained popular since its first publication in 1888. In fact, it's never been out of print. It was filmed in 1907, 1920 and 1957. A television series was made in 1985. The novel has also been serialised on radio in Australia and Britain. Robbery Under Arms gave him an international reputation, and visits were paid to him in tribute by Mark Twain and Rider Haggard. In 1884, Thomas transferred to Armidale, New South Wales, still continuing his magistrate and mining warding duties. He then moved to Albury, New South Wales as chairman of the Land Licensing Board in 1885 and served there as a magistrate and warden from 1887 to 1895. His first Albury home was Morningside, near the junction of Thurgoona and Elm Streets, which has now been since demolished. And by January 1890, the family had moved to a home at 640 Olive Street they called Raby. This house still stands. From 1888 to 1905, Thomas Browne published articles, prefaces to books, including Banjo Patterson's The Man from Snowy River in 1896, and 16 books of fiction, which included 8 novels published as serials and a few short stories. His wife, an expert gardener, published a book, The Flower Garden, in Australia in 1893 by the name of Mrs. Rolf Boldrewood, whilst his eldest daughter wrote, as Rose Boldrewood, a novel called The Complications at Collaroy in 1911, based on various reminiscences of her father. In 1895, Thomas retired to Melbourne. He was the president of the Australian Literature Society until 1902. Named in his honour, the Rolf Boldrewood Literary Awards are awarded annually by the Macquarie Regional Library. Thomas Browne died on the 11th of March 1915, aged 88, in South Yarra, and he was buried in the Brighton Cemetery. And in his obituary, it covers: genial and bearded, Browne was of middle height and robust constitution, interested in all forms of sport and a devoted lover of horses, yet also a wide reader who could quote freely his beloved Scott and Burns, Shakespeare and Tennyson. A friend described him as a gentleman and a sportsman from top to toe, a good staunch friend, courteous, unassuming and loyal, whilst his daughter Rose called him the most philanthropic and generous of men. He was an affectionate husband and father, a faithful member of the Church of England, a transitional figure. He was colonial in his conservative views, belief in the superiority of the gentry, and affection for English traditions, yet reflected the nationalist 1890s in his democratic kindliness, respect for character, irrespective of class, and fervent Australian sentiment. Far from having a purely British outlook, as often asserted, he was proud of being an Australian and thought that the native-born type showed progressive development over parent British stock. And in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 12th of March 1915, there was an article announcing his death. Rolf Boldrewood, famous novelist, death in Melbourne. Mr. Thomas Alexander Browne, Rolf Boldrewood, the famous Australian novelist and author of Robbery Under Arms, died at his residence, Ions, in Kensington Road, South Yarra, this morning. He was 88 years of age and had been confined to his bed for the last 14 months, and his death was not unexpected. He leaves a widow and a family of 7, 2 sons and 5 daughters. The name Rolf Boldrewood, the pen name which the late Mr. T.A. Browne used, was known far and wide. His reputation was not confined to Australia. Robbery Under Arms, that was first published in the Sydney Mail, was known throughout the English-speaking world. But Rolf Boldrewood's fame does not rest upon this book alone, though it is generally conceded to be his best. The Miner's Right, The Squatter's Dream, though not skillfully constructed and not making the same vivid appeal as the classic story of the bushranging days, are both admirable stories. Then there are others such as A Sydney Side Saxon, A Colonial Reformer and Nevermore. Another book, not a novel but a volume of gossipy reminiscences of early Victoria, is entitled Old Melbourne Memories. It is a book that's full of charm. As a writer of romantic novels depicting Australian life and scenes, Rolf Boldrewood stands at the head of the Australian men of letters. No Australian writer has given us more a realistic picture of the romantic side of Australian life. In dealing with the bushranging times and with the gold rushes, he writes with the hand of a master. Mr. Browne was a keen lover of sport. As far back as 1847, he took part in a steeplechase run at Woodlands, Victoria. For a long time he followed hunting and racing very closely, and he was always fond of a day's shooting. Of late years he's been compelled by advancing age to take a less active interest in sport, and this gave him more time to devote another favourite pastime, reading. He was a well-known figure at the Melbourne Club. A little more on Thomas Browne's parents. As mentioned, Thomas's father was Sylvester John Browne. He was born in 1791 in Ireland, and he was the shipping master in the East India Company and married Elizabeth Engel Alexander, who was known as Eliza, on the 8th of February 1826 at the English Church, Port Louis, Mauritius. Elizabeth was 23 and Sylvester 35. Elizabeth was born in Kent, England in December 1803, and she was the daughter of Thomas Alexander and Elizabeth Tefler. The family lived in the West Indies, and not long after their return to England in 1817, her mother died. Thomas remarried in 1814 and had a further 9 children. Thomas Alexander visited Melbourne in 1841-1842 from Mauritius, and he settled up business transactions with Sylvester. Sylvester John Browne is mentioned in 1835 with his property, and it says that on the 23rd of October 1835, 1 flock, 365 sheep, 355 4-year-old ewes and 10 1.5-year-old rams to Sylvester John Browne Esquire at £1 7 per head, and it says that in total he had 482 acres of land. In 1836 at Petersham, he sold 2 acres. Sylvester Browne is mentioned in an article on the 16th of February 1836. says the Solicitor General moved for criminal information against Morne and Park of Sydney for having endeavoured to provoke Mr. John Sylvester Browne, commander of the ship Proteus, to fight a duel with Mr. John Browne, commander of the Nimrod. It would appear that Browne had some misunderstanding whilst engaged at the winding ground. In consequence, Mr. Browne of the Proteus prepared to board the Nimrod, a signal being made from that vessel to that effect, and while on board the Nimrod the commanders quarrelled and a challenge was the result, but they came to no conclusion as to time, the captain of the Proteus saying now or never, whilst he of the Nimrod said he would take his time. On arriving in Sydney, however, Captain Browne of the Nimrod renewed hostilities and sent Morne and marked the residence of Captain Browne of the Proteus with an invitation to the field. This latter gentleman declined to accept, being then surrounded by his family and having no desire to mar their happiness. He was, however, subjected to great annoyance by Morne and Park in consequence of not accepting the message. They not only annoyed him in the public streets, but they went at length to post him in the reading room of the public library as a coward and a blackguard. This notice was signed John Morne. The Solicitor General thought it very hard that Mr. Browne, the father of a family, should be called on by Mr. Morne to risk his life without any quarrel to obtain for the latter gentleman a fighting character, and a rule nisi was granted. It was mentioned in August 1836 that 17 allotments at Darling Harbour at the rear of Mr. Michael Phillips' stores were purchased by S.J. Browne, totalling £2,400. So Sylvester is doing very well for himself if he can afford that amount of land for that much money. In June 1837, it was announced that at Enmore, Newtown, on the 5th of June, that the lady of Sylvester John Browne, Esquire, gave birth to a daughter. And in 1837, Sylvester overlanded with stock to the new settlement at Port Phillip, and in 1838 took up the run at Mount Macedon. And there were some details about his explorations. Overlanding on the hills of Yoldwin in 1837 was Captain Sylvester John Browne, accompanied by his wife's stepbrother, Thomas Barry Alexander, and Robert Shadforth as stockmen, and overseer William Cox in charge of about 18 assigned men. 8 of them were shepherds, each responsible for a flock of 500 sheep. Others were in charge of the drays, one of which carried a boat for ferrying the party across rivers. The stockmen rode a herd of 400 cattle. Browne selected the country east of Yoldwin, running south towards Carlsruhe. About 60,000 acres were originally included, although Glenhope and the Den runs were soon excised from it. Browne's wife Eliza named the run Darlington. It was left in charge of Alexander and Cox. In 1841, Dr. Thomas Bainton acquired part of the run when Browne's financial affairs and mental health were both showing signs of collapse. So in 1839, 2 years after he purchased the 60,000 acres, he brought his family to Melbourne and built the home Heartlands at Heidelberg, that was at that time seen as a country home on the banks of the Yarra River. And in November 1839, another birth notice saying that the lady of S.L. Browne, Esquire, of Flinders Street, gave birth to a daughter. Sylvester Browne was described as a self-made man of imperious temperament and at times rough manners, difficult and high-handed and apt to quarrel. He was mentioned on April the 21st, 1863. There was an advertisement in the paper to the inhabitants of Geelong, Bellarine and Port Arlington for sale by auction, the Retreat Estate, Port Arlington, by order of the proprietor, Captain Sylvester Browne, who is leaving for Melbourne, a 5-roomed cottage, 11 acres of wheat land, 4 acres of garden and orchard, 8 acres of standing timber forming parkland. The plantation consists of 120 of the best variety of fruit trees and 1 acre of grapevines, the whole well watered. And only 10 months later, Sylvester died at his home Heartlands, Heidelberg, on the 22nd of February 1864. Heartlands was burnt down after an arson attack in April 1865, only 10 months after Sylvester's death. And after the captain's death, the family changed the surname to have an E at the end of Browne, possibly because it mentioned how Sylvester had a mental breakdown. Maybe there was stigma attached and they decided to distance themselves. Eliza died in Sydney on the 8th of November 1889, aged 85. So she lived a further 25 years than her husband. The siblings of Thomas Browne. So Sylvester and Eliza had 3 sons and 7 daughters all up. The first was Elizabeth Corentia Browne, known to the family as Corrie, and she was born on the 10th of January 1827 at sea in the Mozambique Channel near Cape Corinthia Straits off East Africa on a return journey on the Proteus to Madras with her parents. Corrie married William Benjamin Walker on the 28th of August 1845 in Heidelberg, Victoria, when she was 18 and William was 25. They moved to Sydney by 1848. Thomas's daughter refers to Corentia in her book The Complications of Coleroy, written in 1911. My father's elder sister Corentia married Mr. William Walker, and they lived at his station, Kamaruka, near Twofold Bay for a time. Later my uncle built Redleaf, a well-known Sydney mansion on the way to Rose Bay, and they resided there until their final departure for England. In 1862, Mr. Walker collected 19 yachting enthusiasts like himself and formed the association afterwards known as the Royal Sydney Yacht Club, and he was the first commodore of the club. So as mentioned, by 1858 they had moved to England. They lived at Hunston House, a mansion, and by 1871 were living at Titmore Lodge, Sunningdale, Old Windsor, Berkshire. Corrie died at Titmore Lodge on the 10th of October 1875, aged only 48, and William and Corrie had 6 children. The second child in the family was Emma. She was born on the 15th of June 1830 at Limehouse, St Anne, London. And in 1854, it's recorded that on the 27th of July 1854 at Woodlands, by the Reverend Dean of Melbourne, Molesworth Green, Esquire, to Emma, second daughter of Sylvester John Browne, Esquire of Heartlands. Emma died at Bacchus Marsh, Victoria, on the 7th of March 1905, aged 74, and Emma and Molesworth had 6 children. Some information about Molesworth Green was outlined in his death notice. Mr. Molesworth Green, one of the eldest squatters in Victoria, died yesterday at the age of 89. He was chairman of directors of the South Broken Hill Mining Company. In 1852, he married Miss Emma Browne, sister of the late Mr. T.A. Browne, Rolf Boldrewood. 1 son and 2 daughters survive him. One daughter is Lady Allardyce, wife of the Governor of the Bahamas, who was the Governor of the Falkland Islands at the outbreak of the war. And Molesworth Green died in 1916. The third child, Annette, she was born in Sydney on the 23rd of February 1832. She married Robert George Massey on the 2nd of May 1854 at the Holy Trinity Garrison Church in Fort Street, Sydney, when she was 22 and Robert was 38. They had 7 children. And there is a death notice on R.G. Massey in 1883 that gives us more of an idea of where they resided. Mr. Robert George Massey, whose death occurred yesterday, was a scion of a highly respectable Cheshire family, where the eldest brother still holds the family estate. He was born in 1815 and came to Australia in 1839 with Mr. Christopher Rolleston. After his arrival, he became engaged in pastoral pursuits at the Hunter and afterwards in New England and Queensland with varying fortune. He was one of the first members of the Queensland Legislative Council after separation and was elected for New England in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly for 1 parliament. For many years he founded and resided in a beautiful home in the suburbs of Sydney called Chesterfield on the heights of Waverley. About 2 years since he removed to Hunters Hill, Parramatta, where he died through a effusion of blood on the brain. Mr. Massey married into one of an estimable family of ladies, a daughter of Major Sylvester Browne, who was the founder of Stanmore, now a popular suburb of Sydney, and consequently was the brother-in-law of the Honorary F.M. Darley QC and Major General Scratchley. He left 7 children, beside Mrs. Massey, for whom the deepest sympathy is felt. One of his sons, Mr. Massey, is the famous cricketer, and his son, the cricketer, was Hugh Massey. Hugh Massey's role in the 1882 Ashes Test at the Oval, with Alec Bannerman as his opening partner, the hard-hitting Massey scored 55 in 57 minutes from just 60 deliveries, with 9 fours to give the Australians a chance. They duly took the match to win by 7 runs. And Hugh's son Jack Massey was also a notable cricketer in the 1910s in New South Wales. And Annette died on the 2nd of December 1913 at St Leonard's, New South Wales, aged 81. The fourth child, Eliza Alexander, was born on the 18th of January 1833 in Sydney. She did not marry and died on the 5th of September 1910 at Wallara, New South Wales, aged 77. The fifth child, Sylvester Jr., was born in Sydney on the 19th of January 1836 and died on the 6th of January 1837. Constantia, she was born on the 5th of June 1837 in New South Wales, and she married James T. Cookshott, Esquire, of South Yarra at St John's, Heidelberg, on the 7th of June 1860 when she was 23. Constantia died on the 23rd of August 1919 at Wallara, New South Wales. The seventh child, Lucy Forrest, she was born on the 25th of November 1839 in Melbourne. She married Frederick Matthew Darley when she was 21 and Frederick 30. They married on the 13th of December at Hunston Church, Hunston. Frederick belongs to a distinguished Wicklow family, but he himself was born in Dublin on the 18th of September 1830. He received his early education at Dunearn College, Tyrone, for where he had a schoolfellow, George Higginbotham, afterwards the Chief Justice of Victoria. He belongs to a legal family. His father was a barrister who held the position of one of the 6 clerks of the Court of Chancery in Ireland. A near relative was a police magistrate in the Irish metropolis, and another relation a Queen's Counsel as County Court Judge for the County of Wicklow. Frederick entered the Dublin University on the 1st of July 1847. He graduated with a BA in 1851 and in January 1853 was called to the Irish Bar. After his call to the bar, he went to the Munster Circuit for some years, where on one occasion he met Sir Alfred Stephen, then Chief Justice of New South Wales, who at the time was visiting Europe. Sir Alfred Stephen recognised the talents of Mr. Darley, advised the young lawyer to cast his lot with New South Wales. In January 1862, the advice was taken and Sir Frederick sailed for Australia and was admitted to the bar on the 2nd of June 1862. Sir Frederick's matrimonial experiences have been as happy as his success in his positions. In 1860, he married in England to Miss Lucy Forrest Browne, daughter of the late Sylvester John Browne of Heidelberg, Victoria. They moved to Australia after their marriage and settled in Paddington, New South Wales. In September 1868, Frederick was appointed to the New South Wales Legislative Council, holding the position for 18 years. In November 1881, he became the Vice President of the Executive Council and the representative of the government in the Legislative Council in the 3rd Henry Parkes Ministry. In Parliament, Darley introduced a Divorce Act and an Equity Act, which granted the wife the same rights as those of her husband. In November 1891, Frederick was appointed Lieutenant Governor of New South Wales, and he was bestowed several knighthoods, including the first one in 1887, which bestowed Lucy with the title Lady Darley. He was also appointed a QC in 1878. The Darleys lived at Quamby, Albert Street, Wallara, which was demolished in the 1930s to become Quamby Place, and they had a mountain retreat, Lilienfels in Katoomba, which is now a hotel. Darley Road, Randwick, New South Wales was renamed from Boundary Street in Frederick's honour, and outside Katoomba on the edge of the Jamison Valley there's a lookout named after Lady Darley and a park called Darley Park. They moved back to England by 1901 and Lucy died on the 6th of April 1913, aged 73. They had 11 children. The eighth child of Sylvester and Eliza, Sylvester John Jr., the second, was born at the family home Heartlands, Heidelberg, on the 28th of August 1841. He married Anne Catherine Stall in London on the 17th of October 1889 when he was 48 and Catherine 32. They married at St Mary Abbots, Kensington, by the Reverend C.P. Green, rector of Clapham and uncle of the bride. Catherine's father was Sir William Jonas Foster Stall, who was the Chief Justice of Victoria. They had 7 children. Sylvester died in September 1915, and it says the death was recorded in the Australian papers of Mr. Sylvester John Browne at Julia Creek, Queensland, at the age of 74. Mr. S.J. Browne was for a short time the tenant of Studley Court. He was the son of Captain Sylvester Browne of the East India Company's service and married a daughter of Sir William Stall, Chief Justice of Victoria. Mr. Sylvester Browne had travelled much in many parts of Australia and abroad, and his name was scarcely less familiar than that of his brother, Mr. H.A. Browne, Rolf Boldrewood, the author of Robbery Under Arms. Many of Sylvester Browne's experiences are embodied in those books. His experiences with bushrangers, his life as a squatter, and on the mining fields of Australia. He has left a widow, 3 sons and 2 daughters. One son, Mr. Roderick Studley Browne, who was born at Studley Court, was killed in action at the Dardanelles on the 18th of June. The eldest son has been serving in Egypt and has been invalided. Another son is with the Army Medical Service, and the youngest Sylvester hopes to join at Christmas. So Sylvester Browne had a gold mine over at Coolgardie around 1893, and there are some fantastic photos that show Sylvester as a young man and also in the goldfields that I'll put on my Facebook page. The 9th child was Laura Lilius Browne. She was born at the family home Heartlands in Heidelberg, Victoria on the 13th of September 1843. She married Peter Henry Scratchley, and they married on the 13th of November 1862 at St John's Church at Heidelberg. Peter was the captain in the Royal Engineers at the time of their marriage and the son of the late James Scratchley, MD, surgeon in the Royal Artillery. Peter was born in France and was a military engineer and a colonial administrator. He served in the Crimean War until the 11th of June 1856, and from July 1856 to October 1857, he was employed on engineering works at Portsmouth. He then served in the Indian Mutiny. He was promoted to captain in October 1859 and was given command of a detachment of engineers to erect defence works in Melbourne, in which he designed. He arrived in Australia on the 13th of June 1860, serving as an engineer and military storekeeper, and became Honorary Lieutenant General of the just developed Victorian Artillery. Peter and his new wife returned to England late in 1863. He became a major on the 5th of July 1872, a lieutenant colonel on the 1st of October 1877, and retired in October 1882 as an honorary Major General. He was knighted on the 6th of June 1885. He visited Papua New Guinea on the 28th of August 1885, but contracted malaria there and died at sea between Cooktown and Townsville on the 2nd of December 1885. His body lay instated at his Melbourne home before being buried in St Kilda Cemetery with military honours on the 16th of December 1885, and his remains were reinterred in the Old Charlton Cemetery at Woolwich, England on the 30th of April 1886. Fort Scratchley at Newcastle and Mount Scratchley in the Owen Stanley Ranges perpetuates his name. They had 4 children, and Laura died on the 5th of August 1917, aged 73. Thomas Alexander Browne married Margaret Maria Riley, and she has a story to tell within her family as well. Her grandfather was Alexander Riley, and Alexander Riley was a merchant and a pastoralist who was born in Middlesex, London in 1778, the son of George Riley, a London bookseller of some education and prosperity, and his wife Margaret Raby. He was the second oldest, with 2 brothers, Edward Riley and Charles Riley, and he also had 3 sisters, Frances, Margaret and Elizabeth. The family was from County Cavan and had a deep attachment to its Irish roots. 2 of Alexander's sisters married Captain Ralph Wilson and Anthony Kemp of the New South Wales Corps, and it was their departure with their husbands for New South Wales that set Alexander thinking of emigrating himself. On the 30th of November 1803, he was one of the first free settlers to go to the colony. He married Sophia Hardwick on the 30th of October 1803 in London, 2 weeks before sailing on the Experiment, and they arrived in the colony in June 1804. Riley acquired a farm at Hawkesbury in August 1805 and then became a storekeeper and magistrate for Port Dalrymple in Tasmania, where his 2 sisters lived with their families. Later that year, Riley was appointed a deputy commissary, which enabled him to grasp the possibilities of international trading. Riley travelled back to Sydney in January 1809 with Lieutenant Patterson, and after Patterson assumed command of New South Wales after William Bligh stood down, Patterson asked Riley to go with him as secretary to the colony, but with a shrewd estimate of the eventual outcome of the rebellion, he soon resigned. Patterson looked upon Riley favourably and granted him generous land grants in the Liverpool area, which Riley called Raby after his mother's family. Riley took on many careers from which he gained wealth. He was known for his role in the international trading firm Jones and Riley with Richard Jones, which conducted an import and export business between Calcutta and Canton. Jones and Riley continued until the 1820s. He developed a trading relationship with his brother Edward Riley, who lived in Calcutta, India, at the time, as well as W.S. Davidson in Canton. He was one of the founders of the Bank of New South Wales in 1816, as well as the first marine insurance broker in New South Wales. He had become a little disillusioned with colonial trade after the losses he incurred in building the Rum Hospital, and from 1812 onwards he became more and more involved in the development of the pastoral industry and the wool trade. He purchased wool from settlers for export and developed his own flocks at Raby. His sheep had only the merest traces of merino blood, but in the inflated wool markets of wartime England, their wool secured an extremely profitable price. Apart from the profit, he liked life on the land. Years after he left the colony, he wrote about his first sight of Raby with great emotion. Unlike other settlers who found the colonial landscape ugly and alien, Riley was deeply moved by the ownership of his land and by the beauty of its situation. In 1817, Riley left the business Jones and Riley and all his other commercial affairs in the hands of his brother Edward, who had moved to New South Wales from Calcutta around 1815 and leased land at Liverpool. Riley bought the ship the Harriet on the 22nd of December 1817 and sailed with his family back to London. It's believed that the reason for his move was frustration with the East India Company's monopoly over international trading, which seriously hampered his interests in whaling and sealing, and his investments in wool had suffered from the collapse of the British wool market in the post-war depression. The advantage seemed to lie with colonial traders in London, and he joined them, operating a mercantile firm. And there's a small article outlining this. Mr. Alexander Riley returned to his native land, taking up his residence principally at the family mansion in Euston Square, with occasional visits to the Manor House, Play Store in Essex. It's believed Riley never returned to Australia, however he did continue to have dealings with New South Wales. In 1819, Riley joined the successful and highly respected firm Donaldson, Wilkinson & Co., who were agents for colonial trade. He chartered the new George Osborne in August 1825, and with the help of his brother Edward and nephew Edward Jr., Riley exported the first of many flocks of Saxon merino sheep to Australia. He travelled with the sheep with his nephew Edward Jr., who was supposed to hand the sheep over to his father Edward. However, due to his father's recent death, the sheep remained in the care of Edward Jr. These laid the foundations for Australia's wool economy, the backbone of Australia's prosperity for the next century. He received a verbal promise from the Secretary of State of a grant of 10,000 acres of land in 1831, similar to what was given to MacArthur, as a reward for the successful importation of a new strain of merinos into the colony. This grant was situated near Yass, and he called it Cavan after his family's Irish home. Riley died in London on the 17th of November 1883. He was a shrewd and capable businessman, but he was also excitable, emotional and highly imaginative, tormented by fits of dreadful anxiety and a little uncertain of his relations with others. His temperament was to negotiate rather than to confront difficulties outright. His son William Edward Riley was born in Campbelltown, New South Wales on the 2nd of November 1807. He took a degree at Oxford and then went on a tour of the continent with a friend, Sir Stuart Donaldson, who then accompanied him to Australia, where Donaldson became the first Premier of New South Wales. William married Honoria Rose Brooks in Liverpool, New South Wales on the 19th of February 1833. She was the fourth daughter of Richard Brooke, Esquire of Denham Court. They had 3 children, Alexander, Christiana and Margaret. They lived both at Raby and Cavan in the Argyll district of New South Wales. William Riley died suddenly on the 4th of December 1836, the day fixed for the wedding of his wife's sister Maria to Lieutenant Zouch. To celebrate the occasion, the groom's friend, Lieutenant Waddy, fired a decorative cannon which exploded, taking off Waddy's hand. Waddy survived, but Riley, who witnessed the accident, collapsed and died, presumably of shock. He was only 28, and his youngest child, Margaret, was not even born until the April after his death. And Thomas Browne mentions in his writings, "My grandfather, who was said to be the handsomest man in London when he left Oxford, died very young, and Sir Stuart Donaldson was left guardian of his 3 children and their property." So Thomas Henry Browne and Margaret Riley's children, they had 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters. The first child, Rose Christiana Engel Browne, was born on the 17th of June 1863 at Squattlesea Mere at Murrabit, Victoria. As Rolf Boldrewood, she published a novel called The Complications of Coleroy in 1911. She did not marry and died at Toorak on the 4th of August 1835, aged 73. The second child, Everard Sylvester Browne, was born at Glenmore, Mulgoa, New South Wales, on the 28th of January 1864. In 1888, he held mining land with 5 other men at Mount Gibbs near Broken Hill. He was involved in his uncle Sylvester Browne's mining adventures in Western Australia, and he married Mary Churnside at Werribee Park in Werribee, Victoria, on the 11th of September 1894. By 1909, he was a grazier and living in central Melbourne. In 1918, he held land at Kurriuk in Victoria's Western District. He went to England in 1924 and died there on the 12th of May 1926, aged 62. They had 2 children. And there was an article mentioning Everard Browne. Mr. Everard Browne, formerly of Kurriuk House, Colac, died lately in London. He was the son of T.A. Browne, Rolf Boldrewood, and settled in the Colac district some 20 years ago after a highly successful experience on the goldfields of Western Australia. Whilst residing in the Western District of Victoria, he became widely known and respected, taking on an active interest in public and social affairs until a few years back when he met with a serious accident, being thrown from a wagonette and suffering a fractured skull. He was a noted polo player, a dashing cricketer and a lover of field shooting. He was married to a daughter of Mr. A. Churnside of Werribee Park and leaves 2 grown-up daughters. Their next child, Hubert Riley Browne, was stillborn, and his birth and death were registered at Wagga Wagga, New South Wales in 1866. Their 4th child, Margaret Emma, was born on the 4th of August 1867 in Narrandera, New South Wales. She married Edric Henry Street at St Matthew's Anglican Church in Albury, New South Wales on the 2nd of June 1892. Edric was a bank manager of the Commercial Bank. Edric's brother was a Chief Justice of New South Wales, Sir Philip Street. Margaret died at her residence at Double Bay, New South Wales on the 8th of August 1931, aged 64. They had 4 children. The 5th child, Gerald Macleay Browne, was born on the 12th of March 1869 at Narrandera, New South Wales. In 1895, he was living in London, working as a mining engineer. He married Olive Smith at St George, Hanover Square, London, on the 22nd of May 1900, when he was 31 and Olive 21. Olive was the daughter of Sir Gerard Smith, Governor of Western Australia. Gerald was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire, so an OBE. Gerald and Olive had 1 child, Rona. He travelled to the Western Australian goldfields and Michigan and New York, USA with his work, and Gerald died in Liverpool, England on the 1st of December 1947, aged 78. Their 6th child, Thomas Valentine Browne, was born on the 4th of October 1870. He was the older twin with Elizabeth Carentia at Concord, New South Wales. He married Emily Cecilia Daniel at St John's Church of England, Toorak, Victoria, on the 9th of May 1903. They had 1 son in 1906 that did not live beyond infancy. He was a metallurgist, an assistant to his uncle, Sylvester Browne, at the Bailey's Reward Gold Mine in Western Australia, and Thomas died in Caulfield, Victoria, on the 6th of October 1909, aged only 39. Elizabeth Carentia, twin to Thomas. Elizabeth married Crawford Henry Mollison at St John's Church of England, Toorak, on the 18th of December 1900. Crawford was a physician, and he'd been married before, and he also married again after Elizabeth died. They had 3 children, and Elizabeth died in April 1920 in South Yarra, Victoria, aged only 49. Her youngest child was 6 when she died. The 8th child, Emily Louisa, was born on the 24th of February 1874 at Gunterwong, Goolong, New South Wales. She married mining manager Robert Silvers Black on the 11th of June 1903 at St John's Church of England, Toorak. Emily was 29 and Robert was 43. Robert had been married previously to Eleanor Archer, who had died in January 1902 when they were in England, and they had 2 children. Robert was in New Zealand from 1905 to 1906, and Emily was living in London in 1911. They were living together at Kalgoorlie, Western Australia in 1920 and in Perth in 1925, where Robert was listed as a pastoralist. Emily and Robert had 2 children of their own, and Emily died in 1962 in Armidale, Victoria. And their youngest child, Vera Millicent, was born on the 25th of August 1878 at Guntawong, Goolong, New South Wales. She married William Henry Peach at St John's Church of England, Toorak, on the 25th of August 1900, when Vera was 22 and William 41. William was an Englishman, and after they married, they lived in England. They went to California in 1903 and then another trip in 1937, and Vera died on the 12th of June 1979 at the age of 100 in London, and they had 2 children. One, Margaret, survived childhood. So a really interesting story of Thomas Alexander Browne, of all of his different occupations throughout his life, but also his family connections and how there were quite a few notable people, sportsmen, politicians and military men that were featured throughout his and his wife's family.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.